So today we're taking a look at my ultimate beginner's guide for Zoom webinar automation. And we're going to be using make.com and Airtable to kind of like facilitate this whole setup. Now, I'm going to hold your hand throughout the whole process, so stick around to the very end where together we will reach Zoom webinar automation nirvana. Without any further ado, let's get stuck in. Let's kick things off with a demo like we usually do. So here we are in Airtable, and what we have is a basic, super basic database where I'm planning to actually run my webinars through. I have my list of contacts, and we can add contacts as we go along. So if there's random people joining your webinar that somehow randomly got their hands on the registration link and they're registered, it's completely fine. They'll be added to your CRM, so to speak. Then we have essentially webinars, and let's go ahead and create a webinar. Then the next thing that I need to do is kind of like say, hey, when is this webinar? And I want to say that the webinar is going to start at 9 a.m. GMT. Duration is going to be 60 minutes. Now, at this point, I can actually add participants, like pre-registered participants, people who I know will want to be notified about this. So I'm just going to go ahead and do that. Just going to add one guy, Jimmy. Yeah, that's basically it. I've added Jimmy. Now, let's go ahead and create this webinar. The system is now going to run, and it's going to update our status, and it's going to basically say that, hey, I'm done. You can see here we have our registration link, we have our join URL, we also have a Zoom webinar ID. Now, let's go ahead and check out Jimmy's email. It takes a few seconds, but it should arrive just about now. Hopefully, a few moments later. I know that everything's fine because I have a participant ID and the system has marked him as invited. So that basically means that everything's okay. We should see that email come through. There we go. And this is what the email looks like. I didn't have to do anything other than just basically make sure that this person has been added like I've just shown you. Now, let's now imitate somebody registering, because that's another big thing. I want to track my registered people. I'm going to copy their registration URL. I'm going to go incognito and I'm going to fill out, that's actually already filled out. I'm going to fill out some details for a new guy who's going to be joining the webinar called John. So everything's filled out, press register. Immediately, we've got John added to our list of participants. And there's also a note saying that, hey, self-registered on such and such date. It's all cool. Let's go ahead and actually start the webinar so that we can see what happens during the process of the webinar taking place and finishing, so that we can actually see how the system pre-fills the join date. Well, not pre-fills, post-fills after everything's taken place. The join date and the left date for each individual participant, so that basically you know who participated in the webinar and who didn't. Let's kick things off. I'm going to start the webinar right now. Start meeting. The webinar is now turning on. Join the webinar, and I know that I'm in webinar mode because I've got this Q&A sort of thing happening, which is not usual for a normal Zoom meeting, so to speak. And I'm going to now use John's laptop over here and join the webinar impersonating John. As soon as John joins, we should have two participants over here. There we go. Two participants, one attendee, John S. Now, I'm gonna superficially wait for a little bit. Right now it's 11:37, so let's wait for about 1 minute so that we can see that John joined for a minute. A minute has passed. We've announced that the webinar is about to come to a close. John decides to leave the webinar. So there's one participant right now, and I'm going to also end our webinar. The most important thing to notice is that right here, as soon as I end this webinar, you'll see how we'll get the join date and left date time populated for us. Hopefully in a few seconds, we should see this. And there it is. Yes. I was a little bit impatient, but it did work. There you go. You can see how John joined between 9:37 and 9:38 a.m. GMT. Let's get into nitty-gritty of this whole thing. First and foremost, with the design of the database. And really, there's not much to talk about. We just have contacts, like I've already kind of explained. This is where we store all of our humans, contacts, right? You can probably expand this to add phone numbers and whatnot, but yeah, it's all well and good. Then we have webinars. This is where we technically store all of our webinar data. I'm only using simple fields here, nothing really crazy, just a name, the create webinar trigger, which we're going to talk about in the automation section of this video. And don't worry, it's fairly easy, fairly straightforward. Then we have just these simple fields. We have our date time field, which is kind of important. You need to have this because you want to track when all of this happens, when the webinar is supposed to happen. Duration field, right now I only have two durations, but you can have as many durations as you need. And it's all very dynamic. Later on, I'll show you how this works with make.com. By the way, if you're new to Make, go ahead and check out the description down below. There is a link for Make where you're going to get a 30-day pro account. It's going to help you massively if you are following along this video. So go ahead and do that right now so that when we get to that point, you're ready. Anyway, we've got our registration URL, join URL, the agenda, the webinar participation link, and we also have our Zoom webinar ID. In terms of webinar participation, this is where is a very important table, so to speak. We are joining the webinar with the contact, and this is what we call in the industry a junction table. Essentially, we're creating an entity out of the marriage of two or more entities. And in this case, the first entity is the webinar itself. The second entity is the contact. We also have some lookups. First of all, I'm looking up the Zoom webinar ID from my webinar table, my contact email from my contacts table. I also have a simple text field for the participant ID, an invited yes or no, some notes, join date, left date, date time to be precise. And we also have a formula here that calculates the minutes that a certain participant was present within a particular webinar, and the formula looks like so. Feel free to copy that. It's just a handy little thing to let us know they stayed for a minute. That's basically it in terms of the database design. There's not much else to talk about. Let's go ahead and check out the automation section. Now, before we go any further, I would like to say that we appreciate absolutely every single person who watches this channel. We're trying to reach a goal of 3,000 subscribers by the end of this year, 2024. I know what you're thinking, this is kind of like a lame target, but we're a small channel. Let's up the ante. If we get 10,000 subscribers by that date, I will say bye-bye to my most precious possession, my beard. Yes, I know, sometimes we have to kill our darlings for the greater good, although I know I am going to severely regret this. Some might say that the automation section of this video is that deluxe double cheeseburger in the sea of side salads, which has been our video so far, but we technically have 3 automations to go through, so let's get cracking. The first one is actually fairly straightforward. We have automation that essentially main purpose is to actually create the webinar, and as a secondary mission, if there are any pre-registered participants, to actually add them into the webinar participants list and update Airtable. First and foremost, do sign up for Make. First thing that you need to do in terms of this particular first automation is to create a webhook. And this webhook is gonna provide you with a URL. Just press add, give it a name, and copy this particular webhook address. Jump back into Airtable and go into automations. And you have to be on the team plan, I believe, for this to work. But essentially what you need to create is an automation over here. Press create automation, and the trigger needs to be in the table of webinars when the create webinar is checked. Then we need to run a script. If you've been on our channel before, you know that I like to use the same exact script every time. The only thing that you need to change here is this webhook URL. Don't use mine, use the one that you've just gotten from make.com. Replace this URL with yours. Don't forget to add your variable record ID, just like I've done here. And don't forget to map your Airtable record ID by pressing this blue plus button over here. Map this particular field, Airtable record ID. Just map it in, press finish editing, turn this on. Don't forget to turn this on. And that's it. You're done with your trigger. The next module in our line of modules, in our chain of modules rather, is one that actually grabs the webinar data like so from Airtable. Then we update the status of that webinar just so that the user actually gets a bit of a sense of what's happening. So here we go. It's basically this particular thing. We want to give updates to the user that hey, something's happening. Wheels are moving. That's what we're doing here. Just a simple update, nothing more, nothing less, just like so. From there, I'm using the create a webinar module. This was an interesting little thing for me. When you're creating your connection to Zoom, you don't have to worry, because previously this sort of thing was a bit difficult with Zoom, but now all you have to do is just add a new connection. It will prompt you to log in using your main account. Super straightforward. As soon as you create your connection, this is how I've mapped mine setup. I'm just mapping the topic in here, the topic from Airtable, type webinar, duration in minutes, and this is an important one. I'm using parse number on the duration variable because I want to extract that number. In our webinar data here, it says 60 min. I just want to use 60, that portion. And the way to do that is to use this little function called parse number to extract that number. Then we have start date and time. Make sure that it all aligns with the time zone that you have set up and make. Time zone London, agenda. You can map your agenda. In fact, I should have mapped that already. So there we go. Agenda gets mapped in there. There's a bunch of different other options, which I haven't selected so far, but I hope you get the point. Now, from there, the next thing that I'm doing is actually, and this doesn't seem to work, but I'm doing it anyway, I'm actually adding the Airtable ID against that webinar. I haven't managed to find it yet, but yeah, feel free to ignore this particular step if you want to follow it, but it doesn't seem to work. Feel free to ignore this particular module. Maybe I'll figure it out someday. The next thing is, again, I'm updating that webinar with processing invites. I'm also bringing in the registration URL from Zoom. I'm also bringing in the join URL from Zoom and the webinar ID. Now, the join URL is one interesting point that I should have raised earlier in the demo. The join URL is one where you can just give this to maybe like a host or maybe some other participant that you want to participate in the webinar, but you don't want them to register. So that's the usefulness of that. That's it. Basically nothing else. The next thing that we need to deal with is those pre-approved participants. And this is a very straightforward thing to do. Just add a router. And then the first route, the one on top, should be first and foremost limited or filtered by this particular field here, the webinar participation field from module number 8. Update webinar data. And over here, essentially, it's this field over here, webinar participation. All I'm doing here is I'm using a function called length that will count the amount of things in this particular field. In this case, there's 2, but at the beginning of this demo, there would have been only one. Jimmy Sonorus would have been the only person there. And because there is something that is not equal to 0, the system will proceed and it will go this way, and it will actually iterate through the webinar participation list of users. I will then fetch that participation record like so. Next thing I'm doing, I'm actually adding an invited filter. In other words, if I've already invited them manually or something like that, there's no need for me to go ahead and process them. You can technically use that invited thing to filter those people out. Maybe you've invited them personally over email, over WhatsApp. You don't need them to get another registration thing. Now, following that filter, the next thing that we need to do is actually get that contact like so. I'm fetching the contact from my participation record. And from there, I'm using the add a webinar registrant module. I'm mapping the webinar ID, email, first name, last name from my get a contact, and that's it. Nothing else. Finally, I'm updating the participant record like so, just by saying that, hey, invited, and the registrant ID goes in here as well. Finally, there's one last step, which is this particular update status module, where I'm basically saying done. I'm also mapping the status from number 8 so that we create this little cascading effect, this like little log of things that happened, so that our user knows that that's it. We finished automation. Now, let's take a look at the second automation, which deals with people registering. Remember when John registered for the event? Let's take a look at how that works. So let's begin with this particular automation where we're going to be tracking the registrations that happen between you saying that you're going to do a webinar and the webinar actually taking place. We want to track the people who register for that webinar. And here's how we do it. It's an extremely simple process. We begin with a different trigger. This time it's not exactly a webhook that we trigger. It's actually a webhook generated by Zoom in a way. Let me show you how it's done. So first and foremost, click on add. I've already done this, but if you're following along, click on add, give it a webhook name. Here we're looking for registration created. Make sure that this thing is checked and press save. Don't forget to add a name, right? I'm gonna close out of this, but basically that's it. Once you've set that up, you're done with your trigger. The next thing that we need to do, we need to actually grab the webinar, details of that webinar, so to speak. And this is what I'm doing here. I'm just mapping the payload webinar ID. So payload webinar ID, this particular field over here, and I'm mapping it over there. The next thing that I need to do, I need to grab the event. And the event is actually important because technically, I was thinking that maybe, we can track other things in this automation, but for now, generally good practice to add a filter here that makes sure that the event is actually the event that we need, because like you saw, you can choose multiple events, and we just want to track registration created. So it's a nice little guardrail towards somebody editing this by mistake. This is what I've done. Event, I'm just mapping this event field over here is equal to, and it's equal to webinar.registration_created. And that's it. The next thing that we need to do is we need to search for that particular contact in our list of contacts. I'm doing it like so, registrant email versus email. You have two choices here. You will either find that person or not find that person. In the case that you don't find that person, things are fairly straightforward. What we have to do is just create that contact in our contacts table. The next thing that we need to do is we need to search that webinar like so, and then the next thing, making sure that we actually find that webinar that we're searching for. And finally, we create a webinar participant. I'm mapping the webinar record ID. I'm mapping in participant ID, or the registrant ID rather, into the participant ID field. I'm marking invited. I'm marking that person invited. And I'm also adding the note self-registered on such and such date. And I'm leaving the join date and left date empty. That's it. In the case that I actually find this person, the next thing that I need to do is I need to again search for that webinar, and I need to find that webinar just like we've done over here. The next thing that I need to do, and this is a little bit niche, I actually need to search for that combo, for that participant webinar combo inside of my webinar participation table. And I'm doing it via this little formula. So feel free to copy that and use that yourself. If I don't find anybody, in other words, this is the first time that I'm seeing, yes, I know about this person, but it's the first time that I'm seeing that combo of this person and that particular webinar, only then will I basically do the same thing as I've done up here. I'm mapping the webinar, mapping the contact, mapping the participant ID, registrant ID, and adding my note. That's the simplest thing in the world. Hopefully you've managed to follow this. Now, the third automation is actually the easiest one of them all. This one deals with the webinar being finished. Here's how it works. Again, we're using the watch webinars webhook, I guess. And then the way to set this up is just to press add, and we're looking for webinar ended. Make sure that this is checked, give this a name. That's it. You've set up your trigger. The next thing that I'm doing, I'm actually using a variable here because during testing, I just need to make sure that I'm able to fetch things, and I actually suggest that you do something similar. So make sure that you name this variable, and I'm using the set variable module. Name this variable something like webinar ID. I'm mapping my webinar ID over here. So webinar and webinar ID, just map that in and press OK. The next thing is I'm doing a custom API call to Zoom. This is the endpoint that I'm hitting. V2, past webinars, webinar ID, and then participants. Simple get, nothing more, nothing less. And that gives me all of the participants over here in the body gives me the 2 participants of that particular webinar, as you can see. The next thing that I need to do, of course, is to iterate through those participants. So I'm using an iterator. The next thing that I'm doing is I'm finding that participant record. And this is actually quite kind of straightforward, right? I'm looking for that user email and that Zoom webinar ID combination inside of my webinar participation records. If I find it, right? So total number of bundles is not equal to 0, then I proceed with updating that joined left date time that we've been craving for. So yeah, that's basically it. There's nothing else to this. Hope you've enjoyed this quick little beginner's guide on how to automate Zoom webinars and to kind of like hook it up to Airtable via make.com. Let me know down in the comments below if you want me to do more content on Zoom. I think it's one of those like missed opportunities that I've had this year, and I think we should do more Zoom oriented content in the new year in 2025. That's it from me. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one. Cheers.